I will talk freely because I cannot inflict a Hungarian accent on your reading actual paper. Recently I gave a lecture in Hungary and they said I had an English accent. I'm fed up with this two-way game. I tried to talk with natural language. Before I start, I would like to raise 3 points. The first of two are memory of two friends whom I would have really loved to be here and who participated the last couple of years in thinking through some of the argument in this paper. The first is Reinhard Koselleck, who died in February, who was mentioned today, and I think whose death is a very, very great loss to our profession and our particular interest in the history of politics and also the history of 18th century political thought. And the other one, of course, the person was mentioned by David yesterday, is Robbie Walker, who recently died and who was my long sparring partner and interlocutor thinking about these ideas. The third one is a more positive point that I'm still struck that there are 3 fellows of King's College talking at such a small conference, and how much I enjoy to listen to 2 of them, because being at a place like King's is a place of emulation, interaction, but not necessarily joint work. And the way we present our work is we just propose them for an audience, and I think the outcome is very interesting. So if people think that there is a Cambridge school, it's not a dogma, it's not a tenet, it's not a methodology, it's a place where an unusually high number of people work on similar topics in a very interesting fashion, which often coincide and sometimes conflict. I just want to express a pleasure that I can come to such a place where people think about my topic very intensely. This also impacts a little bit on the paper itself. It's inevitably influenced by the proximity of John Donne to my work. I'm talking to him all the time. He's a great Locke scholar, and of course he published a very famous paper in a volume which I edited 24 years ago, in which he defined the Scottish Enlightenment in relation to Locke. And this paper, to some degree, is a revision of his ideas. First, I start with a somewhat dissonant idea, is the status of the theory of moral sentiments. We heard extremely interesting accounts of the theory of moral sentiments, but perhaps it is right to call attention to the fact that in the 18th century, and particularly in Scotland, no other moral theorist or political theorist or thinker or literary, whatever way you want to call it, perhaps the exception of Hume, agreed with Smith's theory of moral sentiments. A very strong argument was put forward, first and foremost by Smith's successor at the University of Glasgow, Thomas Reid, and by many others, that it is not moral theory, but a theory of socialization with some consequences for ethical behavior. But it didn't define the distinction between right and wrong. It didn't give an origin for it. It wasn't moral theory. It was something new, a theory of moral sentiments, not an inquiry into the origin of morals. I don't know whether I agree with that judgment. I suspect I don't, and this is not the topic today to discuss it. But historically speaking, we have to notice there is a problem. We may talk about the theory of moral sentiments as moral theory, but moral theorists, whatever that means, didn't talk that way either in the 18th century or in the 20th century. If you look at Professor Schneevin's History of Autonomy, History of 18th century political thought, there is Smith as the dead end of empiricism. And in fact, apart from John Bruce, whom Emma mentioned, there was no impact. And Smith's famous remark about John Bruce was he got rid of too much metaphysics. It wasn't enough moral theory in John Bruce, it was moral science. Now, the reason I'm talking about the issue which is tantalizing, but I don't wish to develop, because I see the current situation about Smith's politics, about the precise equivalent of the accusation about moral theory, i.e. it is not a moral theory, but a theory of socialization. Smith doesn't appear in a single textbook of politics, and if you look at the voluminous literature about Smith's politics, including one which is entitled like that is Donald Lynch's, it is defined as a lack of interest in normative political thinking a lack of political theory, and is something like social anthropology or sociology. Even John Donne and Quentin Skinner, who once wrote a famous review of Ronald Meek, some of you might remember, the TLS, said, this is not continuous with Hobbes, Locke, and our great British political thought, which is the perennial preoccupation of everybody who lives in Cambridge, but is sociology, or sociological thought. Even when people try to get out of this subject, sociology, and I don't mean to be pejorative to those of you who regard themselves as sociology, I just say sociology in the 18th century, what the hell are we talking about? They still say it's sociology. This is not political theory. When they try to do a bit better, and that's when John Donne comes into the story, they say states, Smithians, and of course they always need Marx behind it, modern 20th century social science, don't have normative political theory because they can't make a normative argument. Now here, there's an interesting twist, because Locke, who apparently did make a normative argument and thereby became a founder of liberalism, is said to be both by John Donne and Jeremy Waldron to have made this argument, created normativity purely out of theology. Donne's famous work says that without theology, Locke's work on two criticisms of government and some others are curiosities. John Pocock, a long time ago, wrote about this issue, what is Locke's proper place in the actual history of English historical and political thought in the 17th century. Where they say, properly speaking, he was a resistance theorist, of course, but as a theorist, he was a theologian. And therefore, Smith becomes a sociologist because he's not a theologian. And therefore, they also say, everybody who's not a theologian, since then, is not a normative political theorist. In Cambridge and everywhere else, Rawls is faulted for that. A hypothetical contract, as Voltaire said, is not worth the paper it wasn't written on. So there is no foundation in modern political thought. Because of that, Smith simply falls out the history of political thought. I would like to rectify this. I think we are limping along with Adam Smith. If we talk about his theories of empire, his feelings about this, how he thought about British government, how he wanted to reform the entirety of the British commercial and political system, and we claim that this man, who wanted all these extremely ambitious exercises, and I completely agree with Sankar and Emma, that the enterprise about empire, the expansion of Europe, was an extremely ambitious intellectual account. Can we really imagine that this entirely ambitious intellectual account had no political theory behind it? That's the question which Emma raised. This would have needed a political theory to answer this question. Where is his political theory? Now, I would like to suggest that we can find this political theory if we look for it. And of course, we know that Smith, a cautious man, announced 3 times in print that he did wish to write a major work on the history of law and government. We don't have it, and it becomes clear to us that he really wrote something like that, this ambitious work, from the lecture notes. But once we had the lecture notes of his classroom from Glasgow from the early 1760s, we can see that we have other sources to reconstruct it, and even more importantly, we can see that part of the history of law and government actually appears in the published work. The point which we'd like to emphasize, which I haven't seen before that clearly as I do now, and quite prepared to defend this view, that Book 3 of the Wealth of Nations is entirely taken from the history of law and government, not relying on it, not a bit similar, it is from it. So when Smith later said that unfortunately some of the stuff was published in the Wealth of Nations and therefore he had a difficulty to reconstruct the book as a separate entity, everybody thinks, oh, that's about peace, theory of need, theory of trade, the economic part of the Wealth of Nations, if you wish. Now he published half of the theory of law and government in the Wealth of Nations. But he also published quite a lot of it in the theory of moral sentiments, such as his theory of political authority, which he referred to in the lectures. And we also have other texts which support our reading the lecture notes. I just briefly mentioned this so the scholarly dimensions of this problem become clear. Not only we know that the famous afterword, or the masquerading as a preface of Robertson's History of Charles V was heavily derived from Smith's thought. Of course, the famous Origin of Ranks, which Marxists in the 1960s onwards claimed to be the origin of Marxism in some sense, and work by John Miller is nothing else but an extracted set of lecture notes from Adam Smith. If we put all these sources and published texts together, we actually have a pretty good view what that theory was. And I think we have to reconstruct it. What I'm trying to do is to reconstruct it in its entirety, and what I try to do today is to give you some sense how it might pan out as political theory and history. For me, it's only interesting not only as an enterprise of Smith scholarship, but I think that it's probably, if reconstructed, would be the best way of measuring what happened to Western political theory when it became Hegelian and Marxian. In Marx, the political outcome is not acceptable. In Hegel, you have a theory of world history supporting his politics, but it's based on theology. Going backwards, the last person who tried something like an economic determination of history, bringing together political economy, history, and political theory, but without theological foundations, what's more, without social contracts, without Locke's theological idea of political obligation, was Smith. So I would suggest that if one is a secular political theorist today, this book of Adam Smith, if reconstructed, would become an extremely exciting and important source to study. The way I try to do it is to do through Locke. Now this is partly again to do with John Donne, who developed this argument through Locke, but I would like to go further. Yesterday it was mentioned that it's impossible to understand Smith's work without understanding the unique relationship between Hume and Smith. I think it's quite unique in British history, perhaps in European intellectual history, that a major political, social, and moral thinker became a voluntary disciple, a reader of the work of a near contemporary, somebody who's 10 years older than him, who wrote before him, and he accepts this work and wants to improve on it. The Hume-Smith relationship is absolutely crucial. The same way, I support the view that the Hume-Rousseau relationship is absolutely crucial, and that's the point which now comes into focus. We have talked about how the theory of moral sentiments is influenced by the second discourse. But there's a bit more in the second discourse than the theory of pity and amour propre. It's one of the most important political works of the 18th century or European modernity. It's a critique of commercial society and its politics in a very interesting fashion. How could Smith not learn from this? How could Smith not feel that he had to answer? That the easy way out of this, that the particular notion of the contract, and particularly the rhetorical foundation of the contract as an invention of the talk of the rich to the poor, was completely unacceptable to Smith. And he did say so, referencing it back to Mandeville, of course, in his review of Rousseau. But that's not where the story ends. So I would suggest that the theory of moral sentiments, some of the lectures of jurisprudence, quite a lot of the Wealth of Nations, was a direct answer to Rousseau, as Dick Phillipson and others suggested, Pierre Force, but in a much more comprehensive fashion. At that moment, however, we have a problem. The contract theory of Rousseau, no matter what else he said, was an absolutely unacceptable bit of theorizing to Smith. There we have some anecdotal evidence that he objected, but I would like to say, then, absolutely in the middle of his text, there is an objection. The objection is one sentence is the Wealth of Nations, and that's the problem with that large book. That sometimes one sentence says a whole essay or a small book. Suddenly at some point he says, some people say that there cannot be chieftains before government, before the union, he says. And Smith said, quite the contrary. Before the union, there were chiefs. That's how the union came about. Now, everybody who knows 18th century political thought should immediately recognize that this is an answer both to Montesquieu and Rousseau. If you then go to the lecture notes, it's spelled out. There can be judges before the law. After all, what a judge does is judging a case according to the law. So Rousseau says, no, There cannot be judges before the law. And as Smith said, any understanding of the history of law and government must start from the sequencing idea that there are first judges for a very long time, then courts, then appeal courts, and then finally the legislature, law. The law is an issue of the effort to rein in judges. And there is a huge, persistent attempt to bring together the history of government with the history of legislation and the history of judgeship. This is Locke's theory. If you remember, and I'm really now talking in just telegraphic gesture, showing you where I would like to go. It is Locke's definition of the state of nature that in such a state there are no judges. More because of Locke's problems with Hobbes on the one hand and Hume on the other hand, he developed a history of government in which there is pre-contractual government, then there are chieftains and there are judges, which then later on have to be reconstructed as modern limited or constitutional government. I feel entitled to use it as a Cambridge contextualist if such a school exists, simply because the central part of Smith's lectures on politics is a critique of Locke. The problem with that critique of Locke that it would have earned Smith a place in the history of political thought as the idiom, as the sentences that they did, but we all know that the author was Hume and not Smith. Therefore, we have to ask the question, in what way did Smith go further than Hume in critique of that kind of contractarianism, that particular theory, political obligation, which seems to be as the epitome of normative political thought in the West, or at least in English-speaking political thought? And how did he do so in such a way that at the same time he answered his own teacher, Hutchison, Mandeville, who was behind Rousseau, Rousseau's second discourse in a comprehensive fashion, and of course Smith's favorite author, Montesquieu. So I would suggest that the exercise of finding out what is Smith's political theory is see his answer to all these thinkers at the same time, centering first and foremost on Hume. We know what the theoretical answer is, and therefore what the underlying principles of the theory of law and government would be. The definition which Smith gave of his enterprise was to do what Grotius did with the development of modern natural jurisprudence for the idea of law and justice. The ambition, I think, is breathtaking. To be the new Grotius for politics is a significant and daring exercise. No doubt there is the reason why he didn't finish it, but he did work it out. And he said, two principles needed, not one: authority and utility. Almost all accounts of Smith's politics focus on the principle of utility, which was the Lockean principle in the sense that Locke was the father of the big argument, resistance theory, which based on public utility. But public utility, as a principle of government, as simply salus populi suprema est. The good of the people is the supreme law. This is not Lockean theory and such. And any attempt to develop a prudential account how you does this utility when you could resist is very interesting, but not an advance, nor is it a regression of Locke. If one reads Smith and Hume carefully, they all argue that they don't have any problem with this particular argument in its Lockean form. They have a problem with the institution of consent as based on promise, which they identify as the theory of authority. So I would suggest that all accounts of political theory of that period must reorient themselves from the salus populi argument and this authorization of resistance to the theory of authorization as the theory of authority. Why is it that people follow governments, accept political obligations, obey their leaders? Why one man can lead others? Why there is rule without imagining that it includes a reason-based, express, verbalized, promising system or any equivalent. Hume, in particular, suggests that his theory of government is consent-based. That's why Ernest Barker and the Gandhis of the early 20th century, both in America and Britain, always included Hume under the contract theorists. Not a Lockean contract theorist, but contract theorist nonetheless. The famous theory of justice being an artificial virtue provided a consensual growth through evolutionary cooperation, modern government. I suggest that that's the point, the history of justice and artificial virtue, which Smith takes up both in the Theory of Moral Sentiments and in the new book, as you can see it in the Wealth of Nations and the Lectures of Jurisprudence, and wants to give it a new foundation. The new foundation is the same theory which Nick Phillipson talked about yesterday and other people, is our esteem for the rich. If we look at the theory of authority in Locke and in Smith, we find that they both start from the perfectly obvious idea, also found in Rousseau, that they are not equal. They are equal in some juridical sense. At some point, they are unequal. The inequality of human beings, therefore, can give rise to natural obligation, natural authority, and natural government. And I would like to call your attention that it is very well developed in Chapter 8 of the Second Treatise of Locke. It is not an Lockean idea. If you then look at Smith's enumeration of sources of authority, he simply repeats this argument. And then he adds one single item. The item is wealth, riches. The possession of economic resources also creates authority. And that goes back directly to the sentence which Emma Rothschild quoted today, that Smith said, that Hobbes said, that wealth provides both authority and power. If you remember what Hobbes said in the Leviathan about it, he said, the wealthy man cannot sleep safely because of the envy of the poor. So he can buy off the poor to buy his safety. That's what Smith is approving. But he's now saying that authority, natural authority in particular, can never be stabilized except acquiring power. And that power is not coming from other people promising, nor is it coming from the arms of the gun or the arrows or whatever technology you may imagine. It's not force, it's wealth. This is a foundational theory from Hobbes onwards to Hume and Smith. It is normally known as government relies on opinion and not force. The meaning of this theory, which both Hume and Smith derive from William Temple, that just power in itself cannot survive without authority. And opinion in this sense doesn't mean public opinion, it means the opinion that we have rights, the opinion that people are equal, the opinion that governments are necessary. They are all opinions. These are foundational bricks in the wall of our ideology, but nonetheless they are opinions. That we reverse this version, Smith wants to say at this moment that it's not sufficient to have authority, you have to acquire power. And the way you acquire power is that the way you acquire economic means which create dependency. And dependency and authority together are the two features of modern government. So I would like to emphasize that those passages which we talked about yesterday also include a very interesting description what happened in England in the 17th century. Very interestingly, Smith said, why everybody did for Charles I? What about the other 80,000 people who died? They said, well, we had every right to depose James II because he broke the Stuart Constitution, but it almost failed because the people were weeping on the street when he was escaping from London. Said deference, admiration of the wealthy and the powerful are principles of authority which usually overwhelm calculations of utility. If we think that this is a radical view, compared to Hutcheson, Smith's master, but not to Locke. Remember that Locke himself said that normally, fortunately, people are deferential. So Locke was the most reluctant of resistance theorists and revolutionaries. So any comparison is not between the Commonwealth and Smith. But if we look at Smith, we can see there's a genuine explanation for the missing explanation of Locke. Why is it there is no constant revolution? And I would suggest that Locke was a man of authority who developed a theory which is here corrected. Now I would like now to make two cases for the use of wealth in political theory, because I would suggest that that's where we should look what Marxists of the 1960s, in fact, back to the Lombard fascist of 1918, Husbach and others, saw as the beginning of Marxian economic determinism. I don't think that anything like that is in space. On the other hand, there's an enormous emphasis on wealth and power, and the political economy is a way of life which should underlie our political theory. The first is what happened to the ancients. The shape of Smith's history of law and government was purely a history of Europe. There's no attempt to make, John Pocock pointed out this beautifully in volume 3 of his Gibbon, there's no attempt to write the history of the world. Smith is interested in the history of Europe. The shepherds and the Asiatics are only present because they first destroyed the ancient world and then transformed themselves into modern Europe. But what happens to shepherds, shepherding government, shepherd despotism, the militarism in Asia is of no great interest for him. Book 3 of the Wealth of Nations is the modern cycle from the fall of Rome up to today, up to the 18th century. The first cycle, the history of ancient government, is 3 revolutions. The revolutions are physical destruction. The fall of Greece to the Macedonians, the fall of Carthage to the Romans, and it's a very important case to get our discourse out of an exclusive concentration on Rome and Greece, and then the Germans, the shepherds, the Asiatics destroy Rome. How come that the ancients are important for this history? They are important because an underlying principle of economic determination, or socio-economic determination, or even sociology, suggests that the development of government should be tied to a change in the way of life. Shepherds have government because they have property and inequality, but they have despotic government. At this moment, what's important to notice that here is a follower of Montesquieu who completely and utterly destroys Montesquieu's work on the distinction between monarchy and despotism. Not because he thinks that monarchy is despotic, because he thinks that despotism is an Asiatic and shepherding mode of government, while monarchy is a modern European form of government, or one kind of republic. There is a major dissolution of the foundations of Montesquieu's political science. The way forward from the shepherds, who have military and despotic government, and that's what they bring to Europe twice, and that's the beginning of modern government, Germanic, not ancient, follows the same strategy as Montesquieu. The ancient have no political relevance to modern government. That changes when the Greeks accidentally become an agricultural people. The causation is purely geographical and defensive, and John Pocock already suggested it's actually copied from Montesquieu. They get to Attica. Attica can be well defended, fertile, and small, and suddenly they have to change the way of life. You can't be a nomad in Attica, or not for long. Now the interesting thing here that leads to legal government. That is the sort of government which Locke describes as being under a legislature and therefore having certain limitations. And that's what Smith describes as a republic, a commonwealth. Thank you. The Commonwealth, on the other hand, can go through all rotations of the form of government. An important notion which is in force political theory today, that there can be a republican monarchy, there can be a presidential system, for example, there can be a monarchical, a republican aristocracy, and of course a republican democracy. All these principles, according to Smith, mirror the balance of property, the economic situation, the way somebody lives in a certain territory, and the features of that economy. In that sense, he puts the development which Locke puts at the revolutionary end of early government to the ancient republican government. But what happens to the ancient republican government? It is destroyed. It is destroyed partly from inside, partly because defensively there's a huge world outside, the world of the Asiatic monarchies, the shepherds, which are invited by this internal dissolution of the system, and therefore they become instrumental of their military defeat. But I would like to concentrate on simply one fact. What is it what brings in the external danger and therefore the military device of the republic? Why European history is so discontinuous? Why the ancient republic doesn't matter? And Smith says because these are small countries which develop economically. And at that point he turned to a republican history of republics. He said there are two kinds of solutions for the small state problem which becomes rich, therefore the target of external attack. You either expand, become an empire, you defend yourself by conquering, or you become a preserving defensive republic. The first case is Rome and Carthage, the second one is Greece. 2 points which I would like to make. If this is the case, then we cannot call this history and theory of government jurisprudential. That's one of the reasons why it hasn't developed in modern Smith scholarship, the notion that it's jurisprudential, because it's based on property. Property is a legal fact. Therefore, the domain of jurisprudence is a major obstacle against understanding it. Again, this kind of argument has been pointed out by John Popov in his writings on the Shepherding empires. What really happened to the ancient republics, that both republican strategies, expansive and defensive, fails. It fails for the same reason. Economic growth transforms societies. The military spirit, the great issue of the 18th century, belongs to the shepherds, belongs to the early agricultural republicans. You can't have a developed society and its politics and preserve its military spirit. So there are two kinds of failure: the failure of empire and the failure of the defensive republics. Why? Because of luxury. A famous puzzle in Smith scholarship, why in the lectures on rhetoric and then letters, Smith said the social explanation can always be terminated in an argument on luxury. He said Rome has been destroyed by luxury. We know that Hume carried this argument. We tend to think that this is not a valid argument, but I would suggest that the origin of this kind of economic explanation of political and social change comes from the arguments of the republican tradition. Now one would say, well, this was the story of the ancients, but I would like to show, and that I would finish the paper at this point, showing that this argument remains absolutely central to Smith's argument of what happened to modern government. Modern government is not like the ancient republic because it's not small. You can see the Montesquieu foundations. It also comes from Germanic origins, and here you have an entire history, both the French and the English ancient constitution, the famous missing element of Locke's political thought. What was his view of the origins and development of English government is provided by Smith. But there is suddenly a fourth revolution. And if revolutions are wholesale destruction of civilizations through military force, that didn't happen in Europe. But feudalism, a particularly unfortunate development of the original German freedoms of the German ancient constitution, has been destroyed. How was it destroyed? And the argument is it was destroyed by luxury. Its leading ruling class converted the dependency relations which were the source of the power into consumption patterns. And at this moment, two important points for this particular presentation needs to be noticed. First, the argument that luxury destroys states, polities, and societies which are not particularly adapted to modern economic circumstances applies not only to the ancients, but the moderns. The same thing that happened to the ancient republic happened to the Germanic state which took over. Second, and this is the particular development of the wealth of nations, solution of a logical problem. This is an insight of how such a theory develops. It's easy to say that luxury developed the German state of feudalism. At the same time, Smith said it was an extremely primitive state. It destroyed the ancient world. It went back agriculturally to almost the minimum, and it restarted the entire development. That's why the ancients don't matter. What was the only thing which survived, at least until the Renaissance, from the ancient world? The cities. And the cities, Smith said, are the seat of luxury. They are the people who produce not things which you can eat, agricultural products, but things which you consume. And the survival of the ancient city into the early Germanic, early feudal, early medieval world, and its subsequent development becomes the key of the fourth revolution. How without conquest, feudalism disappeared. And therefore, one could say that Smith ironically and totally self-consciously said that luxury not only destroyed Rome and Greece and Carthage, the same luxury, their luxury, destroyed, fortunately, the bastard state of the Germans, feudalism. Last issue, why did the German lords, the feudal lords, consume? Why did they fall for luxury? And here we again have the famous theory from the theory of moral sentiments. Why do we esteem for rich? They didn't consume. Your stomach is limited. This argument is made both by Rousseau and Smith all the time. They consumed because power was based on wealth, and power had to be visible. It's prestige consumption which destroyed the feudal order. This revolution happened not because anybody destroyed that order, not because there was resistance revolution or popular peasant wars. Politics develops because ruling classes and regimes destroyed themselves by not understanding the changing socioeconomic circumstances. So I would try to suggest that if you look at the sequencing program, the joining of ancient to modern history, the combination of a moral theory to political principles, and that large-scale attempt to provide a single continuous thread from the beginning of European history to the 18th century, explaining changes of government, change of life, change of political economy, and therefore principles of authority and political obligation, you find a complete political theory. And I would like to suggest that it might be a great mistake to say this is sociology, anthropology, history, political economy, but whatever it is not our beautiful normative political theory as practiced in the United States and the English-speaking West. If there is a discrepancy between our modern political theories and Smith, I would suggest we should change rather than try to forget Smith or misread him. Thank you.
With another guest. He's once again found Christians producing and possibly read text